you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Late July had been a miserable time for Ulysses S. Grant and the Army of the Potomac. The first deep bottom expedition failed miserably, and the explosion of a mine dug by the Ninth Corps soldiers resulted in the disastrous Battle of the Crater. Neither attempt by Grant had accomplished their goal. However, by early August, Grant decided to renew the deep bottom expedition. He would do this again by sending the Second Corps under Winfield Scott Hancock with a division of cavalry, but he added more infantry to the expedition by dispatching the 10th Corps soldiers commanded by David Birney. Grant hoped to accomplish a few things by sending Hancock across the James. 1. To draw Confederate General Jubal Early away from Washington, D.C. 2. To cut the Virginia Central Railroad, which was one of his objectives during the last deep bottom expedition. At the very least, Grant hoped that the Union presence of a force north of the James River would draw troops from the Petersburg front and allow him to cut the Petersburg Railroad, also known as the Weldon Railroad. Hancock was chosen to lead the expedition, and although the plan looked very similar to a few weeks before, there was one big change. The 10th Corps and the cavalry would move across at deep bottom, but the 2nd Corps would go aboard ships and steam down the James. This would give the illusion that more of Grant's troops were going to Washington, but in reality the 2nd Corps would just steam out of sight and return to deep bottom at night, hopefully luring the Confederates into a false sense of comfort. From August 13th into the 14th, the 2nd Corps performed their ruse, and the other troops marched across the bridges at deep bottom. Alfred Terry's division of the 10th Corps was ordered to attack at dawn on the 14th. Terry placed his division south of the Kingsland Road, ready to engage with the heavy skirmish line of the enemy. The terrain and spread-out nature of the battle line resulted in Terry's troops not making a huge dent and not even making it to the main Confederate line at the New Market Road. Terry grew concerned about his men's lack of movement and dispatched Joseph Hawley's brigade from its reserve position to the left flank. Terry then ordered Hawley and Pond's brigade to charge. The Federals picked up numerous Confederate skirmishers, and with Robert Foster's brigade wheeling to the west, they eliminated a large number of enemy skirmishers and could now deal with the enemy on the New Market Road. One Union soldier found that the skirmishers had prepared breakfast, but the attack forced them to abandon their food. He wrote, "Our men, breakfastless, snatched at the freshly cooked rations of bread, cooked in the peculiar Southern style, and skillets with coals, and at the strips of fat bacon, while waiting for the arrival of their own cooks with baked beans and coffee, satisfy the sharp monitions of their healthy Yankee appetites with the captured food." Before Birney could order his troops in an all-out attack on New Market Heights, Hancock ordered the men to halt. The 2nd Corps had been delayed in getting off the boats at deep bottom, and it would be afternoon before all the troops debarked north of the James River. Grant himself came to the 10th Corps sector to observe. One historian relays a story of an act of kindness on the part of Grant. About 10 yards behind the 1st Connecticut Battery, a badly wounded soldier lay in the middle of the lane and in the sun. As the General-in-Chief observed the effect of the battery shells, he heard the moan of the soldier, on whom his horse nearly stepped. Grant dismounted and beckoned his orderly. Grant took the soldier by the head, the orderly took the soldier by the feet, and they carried him gently out of the road and placed him in the shade of a tree. The General-in-Chief sent his orderly galloping off to return a few minutes later with a hospital squad that carried the wounded man to the rear on a stretcher. A private nearby recalled, "No human being but the orderly and myself saw this kind act of the general, who was in command of 1,000,000 men, and none but soldiers familiar with the scenes of a battlefield can fully appreciate the act." Grant looked at New Market Heights and told Birney that the 10th Corps would not make an assault on the Confederate works, but to form a junction with the 2nd Corps to the east. Cohen's brigade and part of Hawley and Foster's brigades connected to Gershom Mott's left flank near Bailey's Creek. On the extreme Union right, Barlow's division was sidling around the Confederate left flank. Oscar Brody's brigade advanced against a brigade of Georgians across Bailey's Creek. One rebel remembered, "Our fire made wide breaches in their ranks, and after the 3rd discharge the whole line wavered and fluttered like a flag in the wind. Another shell exploding in their midst, they broke and fled in every direction, without retaining a shadow of their former organization. In their frantic haste to get out of range of our murderous shots, they threw away guns, equipment, and all their warlike paraphernalia." Brody's men withdrew to a safe distance to escape the artillery fire and musketry. The far left of the Confederate line was held by 2 cavalry regiments who used carbines in combat. One Federal thought they were using repeating rifles, they fired so fast. George Macy's brigade was next to launch an attack. They got further than Brody's men, but were met by the same withering fire. One Union soldier recalled, "When the line halted and fell back, and some took shelter behind some old buildings, I found a good position behind a hog pen where I could load and fire between the boards of the pen, the heads of the Rebs being in plain sight behind their works. I would load and fire, taking good aim until I had fired about 6 or 8 times in that way, when an officer who was posted behind an old building, just behind me with a lot of men laying low, sent and ordered me to stop, as he said there was danger of my shooting our own men. But I knew there was no danger of that. I guess he was afraid that I would draw the Reb fire on them." Macy's men were pinned down and could only withdraw when night covered the battlefield. The troops of David Birney wouldn't get a chance to rest long, because Hancock intended to turn the enemy's left flank. Beginning in the evening on August 14th, Birney pulled his troops out of their forward position and began moving them to the Union right. They marched throughout the 15th with men suffering from heat stroke. The Virginia sun turned thousands of men into stragglers and sent hundreds to the hospital. But by the evening of the 15th, the troops were in position for a dawn attack on the 16th. On the 15th, Robert E. Lee came to his new headquarters on the front lines to examine the fortifications at New Market Heights. He was advised not to move too far forward because Union artillery were trained on the position, but Lee insisted on seeing the whole field. Lee dismounted his horse and studied the Union troops' movements. On the way back to his horse, he stopped, bent down, and picked up an unfledged sparrow from the ground, and, not seeing a nest anywhere near, gently placed it in the fork of a tree. The soldier who observed the scene commented, "How could he turn from the thoughts of savage war to pity for this infant bird? Here was the fullness of manhood, honor, courage, gentleness. Do you wonder what I saw in him to make me think that he was the greatest man in the world?" The Confederates had responded just as Grant expected. Any troops that were destined to assist Jubal Early had been halted for the time being, and troops were diverted from the Petersburg front to assist Charles Field, the division commander on the field at New Market Heights. However, after 2 days, Hancock had been unable to turn the Confederate flank and threaten the enemy capital. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. The sky was cloudless. The sun had a full head of steam on. Not a breath of air was astir in the dense woodlands through which the infantry brigade marched and countermarched, and water was not to be had except at the slow-flowing wells of the few denizens of the section. Alfred Terry's division of David Birney's 10th Corps stood in the oppressive heat since 3 a.m., ready for their assault on August 16th. It was around 6 a.m. when they stepped off to attack the Confederate position, but they soon ran into a problem. Fusel's Mill Pond blocked their way. Although the 2nd Corps had encountered it a couple days before, that information wasn't passed on to the 10th Corps. So Terry pulled his brigade back and reorganized them for another assault, and this time they would avoid the mill pond. They pushed off again for the 2nd time, but came to a deep ravine and encountered stiff resistance. Terry pulled back and sent word to Birney, telling him of the infantry in his front. Birney told him to go forward anyway. Terry reorganized his division for the 3rd attempt and attacked again. The ravine gave his men a lot of trouble, but the depth of the ravine and the forest shielded them from the enemy bullets. Charles Field, the Confederate division commander in that sector, sat in a field with his staff behind Ambrose Wright's brigade. His nephew, an adjutant general, stood up and said, "General, they are breaking." Field replied, "Well, I knew they would." His nephew clarified, "But General, it's our men." Field stood up and witnessed his line split in half, with Terry's men plunging through the gap made in the Confederate line. Robert E. Lee was near the situation as well. He could hear the attack and the chaotic sounds coming from the front. He rode forward, saw the men running, and tried to rally them. He yelled, "My friends, rally, and go back and help your fellow soldiers. Drive these people back. We must drive them back and retake those works." Many of the soldiers didn't heed his call, and Lee's staffers worked tirelessly to reorganize the soldiers. In the meantime, the Federals were gaining ground. Pond's brigade was the main unit to break through. Foster's brigade only partially got through the enemy works. The left side of the brigade remained outside the enemy's former line. One Union soldier described the scene. It was almost like the rising of a stage curtain. The rebels were being taken prisoners by the first line, its attack having been too furious to permit a retreat. Between the edge of the woods and their works, the ground was rising, very marshy and well filled with fallen trees and other obstructions. Over all these we clambered, and hastening up the declivity, entered the works and joined the first line in loud huzzas at the victory. Terry took Hawley's brigade and tried to expand the breakthrough, but the Georgians from George Anderson's brigade on the Confederate right came up about that time and halted Hawley's advance. In another effort, Terry ordered Calvin Craig's brigade, detached from the 2nd Corps, to continue the attack. They rolled up the Confederates on the Union left, but were eventually halted, just like Hawley's men. It now became somewhat of a standoff as the Union soldiers couldn't go any further, but refused to give up their ground. A detachment from Evander Law's old brigade, commanded by William F. Perry, went forward, consisting of the 15th and 48th Alabama. This detachment was commanded by William C. Oates of the 15th. Oates attacked the left of Craig's line, partially driving it back, but the Alabamians couldn't maintain the momentum, and it devolved into another stalemate. Craig, in the fight with the Alabamians, received a mortal wound to the head. His replacement would be Colonel John Pulford of the 5th Michigan. This Detroit lawyer had already received 5 wounds. A cannonball fractured his skull, jaw, and collarbone at Malvern Hill. He was wounded at Chancellorsville once, and wounded twice at Gettysburg, and received a broken back at the Wilderness that partially disabled his arms. More Confederate units descended on the bulge in the Confederate line. As the 5th South Carolina marched toward the scene, their 2-mile journey at the double quick had their tongues hanging out of their mouths like hounds, as their commander described. The commander of the regiment saw General Lee and wanted the commanding general to see his men in the best light, so he ordered, "5th Regiment, right dress." Lee responded, "No time for right dress, Colonel. Charge 'em, boys," with a hearty shout. As the Confederate reinforcements increased, Union troops and the breakthrough decreased. Rebel bullets reduced the number of Federals, but so did the sun. Both Hawley and Pond went down with sunstroke. Terry repeatedly sent word to Birney for reinforcements through couriers, but he finally went personally to Birney to ask for those reinforcements. By this point, most of the Union troops were in the former entrenchments of the rebels, having been pushed back by mounting pressure and running out of ammunition. Nevertheless, Birney sent William Cohen and Francis Osborne's brigades forward. When they got to the abandoned Confederate entrenchments, they stopped to catch their breath. Then Osborne's men advanced into the open field. A deadly crossfire ripped into the brigade. It lost multiple commanders, and by the time it essentially disintegrated, it was led by a captain. Robert E. Lee was still near the front as the fighting continued. General Lee busied himself in rallying and reassuring the troops who had been driven back. To some he used words of gentlest kindness, praising them for what they had accomplished. Others he sternly upbraided and ordered them back into the fight. His presence and words seemed to work magical influence on both classes. Lee ordered a surgeon to examine each man that passed to make sure they were indeed hurt before allowing them to pass to the rear. The Confederate regiments attacked the Union position, would be thrown back, and another would charge forward. During one of these lulls in between attacks, a Union chaplain brought the Federal soldiers a watermelon. It was speedily cut up and divided, General Foster very glad to get his share. What could have been more refreshing under fire? Before it was finished, orders were given for our regiment to swing around, fronting to the left and covering the flank, on which an attack was momentarily expected. It was comical enough to see officers forming their men, enforcing their orders with brandished slices of melon, and taking a bite between each command. A concerted effort on the part of the rebels saw them dislodge the Union troops from their position. One Union soldier remembered, "I have seldom been so close to the enemy before. Our corps was flanked on the left completely and driven back. Union and rebel colors waved from the same parapet. The flag of a Virginia regiment and the flag, tattered and torn, of the 97th Pennsylvania Volunteers were planted not 6 feet apart. That was hot work, but we brought the flag off in safety." The Federals were thrown out of the entrenchments, and many prisoners were taken. The blue captives marched by Lee, and as they did, one Union private yelled to Lee that a Confederate private had stolen his hat, a death sentence in that heat. Lee asked for him to point out the Southerner who took it. He did, and Lee had the hat returned. The next day, Winfield Scott Hancock, the commander of the Union expedition, asked for a truce to collect the wounded and dead between the lines. It was granted, but the Confederates had already cleaned up the battlefield, signaling that they commanded the sector and essentially letting Hancock know he was defeated. They did exchange their dead, however. One Union soldier remembered, "We met the rebels halfway between the lines. I saw thousands of them swarming their works, and scores came to meet us, bringing on stretchers the ghastly, horrible, mutilated dead whom we had lost in the charge of the day previous. The sight and smell would have made you wild, but we are used to it." Over the next couple of days, some heavy skirmishing occurred, but it mostly consisted of the two sides looking at one another, and at one point, a lull lasted so long that soldiers on opposing sides met between the lines to exchange coffee, tobacco, and newspapers. Grant finally called off the expedition, and Hancock would pull his troops back across the James River, but not for a rest. Grant had another idea in mind. The Deep Bottom expedition, he hoped, would pull troops away from Petersburg so he could strike at the Weldon Railroad. It had worked, but with Hancock leaving, Lee was pulling troops back to Petersburg. After the major fighting on the 16th, some of Hancock's troops were dispatched across the James to assist the 5th Corps in their attempt to sever that railroad. When the 2nd Corps made it to Petersburg, the days of hard campaigning wore down the troops so much that they had barely had the energy to perform simple duties. One soldier remembered, "On the arrival of the regiment in camp, it was sent on picket. Dirty, sore of foot, and stiff in body, we crawled in the picket line. So very warm had it been during the week of active service that the varnish fried out from the butt of my pistol at my back, and it was painful to touch the surface of my rubber blanket with my neck, and so pressed was my underclothing that in removing it, the skin and spots came with it." At the Second Battle of Deep Bottom, the Union lost 2,901 soldiers, and the Confederacy lost less than half that number, with 1,250. Most of the Union casualties came from the 10th Corps, losing 1,678.